Okay, so the purpose of this video is to be a quick and down and dirty one-off explanation of some of the language we use to label joint actions when doing movement analysis. I think this is probably easier to do on video than it is in text, and hopefully it'll be less painful as well. This is just meant to be an introductory video. I'm not going to get in too much detail, but I just want to take a moment to make certain movements and ideas pretty clear. So beginning at the ankle, I'm going to talk about two common movements that we see in climbing. These aren't the only movements found in the ankle, but these are the two that concern us today. They're both labeled actions of flexion, and they are dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So if I pull my toes up towards me, that's considered dorsiflexion. And if I move my ankle to point the toes away from me, that's plantar flexion. Obviously, dorsiflexion is engaged every time you do a toe hook, for instance, and plantar flexion, anytime you're pressing down hard on a toe hold, raising your heel up, that's plantar flexion. Now, whenever we're doing movement analysis, we always have to take into account the natural action of gravity in whatever position the body is in relation to gravity. So, for example, in a standing position, what keeps us upright is the work of the so-called anti-gravity muscles. But if I were to relax all those muscles and to crumple into a pile, you would see that in a natural standing position, gravity is a dorsal flexor of the ankle joint. Okay? But we always have to be looking at the relationship to the line of gravity. So for example, if I step up onto the step over here, and I have this, you'll notice my heel is off the edge of the board, and it's in a neutral position. Again, gravity would be a dorsal flexor. So what I'm doing here, in order to maintain the neutral position, is plantar flexion. It doesn't look like it because the heel is neutral, but if I relax, that's what would happen. Now, if I were to just lift my leg up like this, then gravity would naturally plantar flex, and it would take muscular effort to pull the toes up into dorsal flexion. Okay, moving on to the knee, we're going to talk about flexion, and we're also going to talk about extension. The knee joint, flexion looks like this. Lifting in this position is lifting the foot up, and extension would be returning the foot to the lower position. From here, gravity is a natural extender of the knee. But in a normal standing position, like if I were to relax all the anti-gravity muscles and crumple to the floor, you'd see that gravity is actually a natural flexor of the knee. On to the hip then. The hip also has flexion and extension. Hip flexion is when we move the hip out in front of the body like that. Hip extension is when we move the leg behind the body like that. The hip also has other ranges of motion as well. The hip joint can move the leg away from or closer to the body. Moving the leg away from the body is called abduction, and then returning the leg to a more neutral position, in this case, would be adduction. So this would be abduction and adduction. Now the hip joint can also rotate. We have outward rotation of the hip joint, where you can see both my foot and my knee are rotating outward. So it's not just the ankle that's making my foot go there. And then we have inward rotation. Again, look at the movement of the whole leg. This is clearly the entire leg moving back and forth. Outward rotation, inward rotation. Outward and inward. Now, the interesting thing is, and something we need to keep in mind with climbing, where we often have one or both feet planted, is that a lot of these movements can take place in a way that doesn't move the leg, but it moves the body in relationship to the leg. For example, we can do outward and inward rotation with the foot planted, and it looks like this. This is outward rotation of the hip, inward rotation, outward and inward. It's the same muscles doing the work, but because the foot is planted, it has a different effect on the body. Moving on from the hip joint, then, we move into the trunk. The most common and well-known action of the trunk that anyone who's done a crunch or picked something up off the floor knows about is trunk flexion, and that would simply be bending forward like that, like I was going to pick something up off the floor. Starting in this position and standing straight up again, that is a movement of extension. So we have forward flexion and extension. We also have lateral flexion and extension at the hip. So I can bend side to side. If I'm bent over, that's lateral flexion, and then I can return to a normal standing position through extension. And same on the other side. So we have forward flexion and extension, and we have lateral flexion and extension. Then, just like the hip joint, the trunk can rotate as well. We have a little bit of rotational movement. And some of the movement you see here, it looks greater than it is because of what's happening at the hips and at the shoulders, but I think everyone agrees that there is a degree of which we can rotate our trunk and our spine. Now, moving on to the shoulder, the shoulder is a harder joint to work with and to label the actions of because it has such a tremendous range of motion. So I won't cover them all. Let me just hit some of the basics. In a natural standing position like this, gravity is an extensor, or gravity extends the arms. So this is considered a position of extension. If I move my arm up over my head like that, that's considered shoulder flexion. So this is flexion, extension, flexion, and extension. Now, as you know, we can also move the arm out away from the body, and this is called abduction and adduction, just like it was at the hip joint. So we have abduction and adduction. Now, we can also talk about horizontal movement at the shoulder joint. So if I start in a position of abduction and move the body horizontally, or move the arm across my body horizontally, excuse me, that's horizontal adduction. And then if I start in a horizontally abducted position and move the arm out, that's horizontal abduction. There's a lot of other motions that we can talk about with the shoulder joint. We could talk about the scapula. We could talk about elevating the scapula and depressing the scapula. We can talk about the rotational movement of the shoulder joint, but I'm not going to go into the details of that for now. The main thing is just to remember that this is flexion, this is extension, this is abduction, this is adduction, and then we also have horizontal abduction and adduction. So now, moving on to the elbow joint, we're just going to talk about flexion and extension there. So this is starting here, this is a full extended position. Moving the hand up, like doing a bicep curl, that's flexion. So this is flexion and extension. We can also talk about the wrist and fingers in similar terms. There are other movements of the wrist and fingers, but let's just talk about flexion and extension. If I start here with my hand in a neutral position, and I bend at the wrist, bend my hand forward, that's flexion of the wrist. Actually, this is flexion of the wrist and extension of the fingers. And then if I start in this position and I go back in the other direction, that's called extension of the wrist. Similarly with the fingers, if I curl my fingers inward, that's flexion. If I straighten them out, that's extension. Now with climbing, it's important to note that we often see wrist extension and finger flexion combined together. Like imagine if you're on a vertical face and you're doing a closed crimp position. Typically what you see is the climbers pressing their palm into the wall below the hold. So in that kind of position, you see there is some wrist extension there. At the same time, the fingers are flexed. That's extremely common in face climbing. Another position that's really common that has this feature is a hand jam. Hand jams are typically a matter of extending the wrist, and flexing the fingers. So that's wrist extension and finger flexion, and that's what creates the camming action that keeps the hand secure in a crack. Okay, so those are some of the basic joint actions and words we use to label them found in climbing and of course in everyday life. Now, one of the challenges of movement analysis in climbing is obviously that we pretty much never look at a single joint in isolation. Climbing is a closed kinetic chain activity by and large, so the actions of joints in one section of the body or one part of a body segment are affecting the joint actions in other parts of the body or other body segments. The body of a climber is often changing its orientation to the line of gravity as the climber moves, so that makes movement analysis more complicated. So, keeping those things in mind, let me just give a very simple example of what a multi-joint analysis might look like in a climbing move. Let's say that you're on a vertical face, and the move we want to analyze is the movement of the arm as you grab a crimper over the head and your body rises up in relationship to that crimper. The starting position of that move we would describe as one of shoulder flexion, elbow extension. There would be some wrist extension as well, and finger flexion. Now, what happens as the body rises in relationship to that handhold? Well, we see that the shoulder is extending, we see that the elbow is flexing, and we see an increase in the angle of wrist extension the lower the hold comes in relationship to the body. I should also point out that in moves that are really long, holds far apart, or a shorter climber doing the same move with holds not so far apart, there's frequently a change that occurs at the elbow. At the beginning of the move, it'll be elbow flexion, but as we get towards the end of the move, there's a shift to elbow extension. So, depending on how low that handhold comes in relationship to the body, the analysis can be more difficult. In a very simple analysis, it would just be shoulder extension, elbow flexion, increasing wrist extension. But if the move got longer and the athlete changed into pushing down on the hold, so to speak, then we would see elbow extension combined with shoulder extension. Actually, at that point, you're probably starting to see some hyperextension at the shoulder joint, which we didn't cover hyperextension because it gets kind of complicated. Anyway, that's what one form of movement analysis might look like. Now, here's another one. Let's say you were on a Gaston, and you started with the Gaston, let's say, again, a crimper on a vertical face to make it easy. And you're pushing your body in this direction with that Gaston. Well, what do we see there? We see that the shoulder joint starts in a position of horizontal abduction. We see that the elbow joint starts in a position of flexion. And of course, we're going to see some degree of wrist extension and finger flexion. Now, as the move begins and continues, the farther away you push that hold, what do you see happening? You see that the shoulder joint stays largely stable. There might be a little bit of movement, but we'll say that it's being stabilized in a position of horizontal abduction. But we're seeing elbow extension, and here's where you really see a lot of wrist extension in order to maintain finger contact on the hold. You see a great deal of wrist extension the farther that Gaston gets away from the body. So those are just two examples. I'll definitely be covering more in future video analysis, specifically the David Graham video. I hope this helps, and thanks for your time.